A quick note before we get started. Earlier this week, on February the 15th of 2021, our guest, Jason Sanford, published an in-depth report on the calls for political violence that have been taking place over on the Bane's Bar forum, which is run by the science fiction publisher Bane Books. Since that report went up, Jason has received numerous threats online. In light of that, I would like to urge you, if investigative journalism is at all important to you, to support Jason's work over on Patreon. This episode contains some strong language. Additionally, there's a content note for non-explicit mentions of torture in this episode's reading. If you would like to avoid this content, you can skip ahead 16 minutes from the start of the reading. Now, on with the show. I've got good sound wigglies.
And I do too, and they're jumping all around.
Excellent. All right. Hello, and welcome to Tales from the Trunk, reading the stories that didn't make it. I'm Hilary B. Bisnieks. Today, listeners, I'm very excited to have an author of science fiction, fantasy, and the genre grapevine column on Patreon, Jason Sanford. Jason, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I've had you on. I feel like I say this every episode at this point, but I've had you on my wish list. I have this project tracking sheet that I use for my podcast, and I've had you on my guest wish list since I started the show, pretty much, and had the good luck in the past year that we've ended up in intersecting communities where I could make this happen without just being like, hi, I'm a random person.
Yes, no, absolutely.
So, Jason, you're going to be reading your story, The Wheels on the Torture Bus Go Round and Round. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's a play off the famous kids song.
Excellent. And is there anything that you need us to know about it before we get into the story?
No, this is a complete story. I'm able to read. It's one of my, I got to be honest, I don't write a ton of stories that are shorter, that are under 3,000 words or even under 2,000. This is one of the few. And it just never had any luck in landing.
I totally feel that. Well, I am ready when you are.
Great. The wheels on the torture bus go round and round. All the neighborhood kids, except for Jane, cheered when the torture bus stopped in front of Miss McKinney's house. After all, her roses were far too red, and her white-painted house far too dazzling, and she continually asked kids not to shortcut across her lawn of perfectly cut grass. Jane tried explaining that Miss McKinney was nice and didn't deserve the torture bus. However, Benny pushed Jane aside and declared that Miss Kinney deserved to be hurt. I knocked a baseball in her backyard last week, Benny said, and she didn't return it. He said this last part as if he'd just revealed the suspect behind a grisly murder. Did you get your ball back? Jane muttered. The other kids rolled their eyes. Doesn't matter, Benny snapped. It's my ball. You don't give it back, that's stealing. Benny wasn't the biggest kid in the neighborhood, but he was the meanest and he knew how to punch. Plus, his parents had been subjected to multiple visits by the torture bus. Benny told anyone who'd listen that he no longer feared punishment for his misdeeds. If his parents could survive the torture bus, so could he. Jane fell quiet as the other kids glared at her. Those kids were certain they were right, and for them Miss McKinney clearly resided on the evil side of the neighborhood. They watched as the torture techs opened the back of their yellow bus and wheeled out an Iron Maiden stretcher and a satchel of scary tools. The techs wore black coveralls embroidered with a grinning cartoon devil holding a red whip. The lead torture tech skipped happily to Miss McKinney's door and rang the bell. Miss McKinney opened the door, her entire body shaking, and she let them inside. Once the door closed, the kids ran across the street and stood on her lush green lawn. Jane didn't want to go, but Benny grabbed her arm and dragged her along. The kids listened as Miss McKinney screamed. Everyone but Jane oohed when Miss McKinney shrieked. Everyone but Jane ahed when Miss McKinney cried. And when Miss McKinney begged for mercy, everyone but Jane laughed because they knew begging for mercy did no good. Jane tried to leave, but Benny held tight to her arm. When Jane finally said she had to go home or she'd miss lunch, Benny nodded like a beach ball bobbing in a pool of splashing kids. "Let's listen up close," Benny whispered, "from the bushes. Then I'll let you go." Jane and Benny hid in the bushes beneath Mrs. McKinney's living room window. Being this close to the house made Jane feel as if Miss McKinney's cries shimmered in rainbow colors, as if Jane saw the screams in reds and whites and blues instead of hearing them. Sickened, Jane turned to leave, but Benny sucker punched her in the stomach. Jane doubled over between the house and shrubs. She gasped, tried to stand, couldn't. She fell back, still gasping. "You'll leave when I say," Benny said with a snort. When the torture techs left 2 hours later, the other kids applauded. The lead tech, a tall man with the name Leroy sewn on his coveralls, waved at the kids before the torture bus drove away. Only then was Jane allowed to stagger home.
Oof.
That night, Jane didn't sleep well. She dreamed of baseballs bouncing into Mrs. McKinney's yard, causing the old lady to cry out in pain each time one touched her lawn. Jane woke screaming, as if the torture bus had parked inside her head. Her mother opened the door to her bedroom. "Bad dream, hon?" Mom asked. "What did Miss McKinney do," Jane whispered, "to make the torture bus come?" Mom sat on the edge of Jane's bed and hugged her. One of those reassuring hugs Mom frequently gave when Jane was young. But Jane was too old for that and pushed the hug away. "Seriously, Mom," she said, "what did Miss McKinney do?" Mom sighed. "How should I know? Maybe it's all of what we do. The times you're nasty to some stranger, the moment you gave the finger to another driver, the day you called in sick at work so you could go to the beach. Our sins add up." Mom kissed Jane on the forehead and walked back to her own bedroom. But now Jane definitely couldn't sleep. Were her sins being compiled somewhere? She opened the blinds on her window and looked across the street at Miss McKinney's house. A single light glowed from a second-floor window. The silhouette of Miss McKinney stood behind the glass as if contemplating the neighborhood. Jane thought about turning on her own bedroom light. Maybe if she blinked the light, Miss McKinney would know she wasn't alone. But she didn't. Instead, Jane stood in the dark and watched until Miss McKinney's own light turned off. Jane lay back down in her bed, but she still couldn't sleep. The next afternoon, Jane sat on her front lawn, tossing a baseball into the air and catching it without a glove. Benny and the other kids were at the park playing a pickup game. Even though Jane was the best pitcher in the neighborhood, she refused to join them. She knew if Benny or the others teased her about yesterday, she'd lose her temper, which would cause Benny to beat her up, or worse, her own anger might make the torture bus arrive. As Jane sat on the grass, forcing herself to think happy, non-sinful thoughts, a small white van with no markings on the side stopped in front of Miss McKinney's house. A tall man in a plaid polo shirt stepped out holding a black bag. He walked to the front door and rang the bell. Jane recognized him as the lead torture tech from yesterday. When Miss McKinney opened the door, the man walked in without being invited. Miss McKinney hesitated before slowly closing the door. Jane glanced at her own house. Mom wasn't watching her right now, and no one else in the neighborhood had noticed the torture tech, probably because he wasn't driving the scary yellow torture bus or wearing his usual black overalls. Jane ran across the street and stood in front of Miss McKinney's house, tossing the baseball and catching it as if she had nowhere else to play. She did this for nearly a half hour before the front door opened and the tech walked out. He thanked Miss McKinney, who grinned nervously and said it was her pleasure, before closing the door. Leroy was embroidered in small letters over the right pocket of the man's shirt. As he walked to the van, Jane dropped the baseball, which rolled under the vehicle. "Let me see if I can reach it," Leroy said, kneeling and looking under the van. "May I ask a question?" Jane asked. Leroy stopped reaching for the baseball. "Might be dangerous," he whispered. "You'll be on people's radar. They'll see you talking with a torture tech. No one's watching, and you aren't in uniform. You'd be surprised what people notice, even on discreet follow-up visits like this. But go on. What's the question?" "What did Miss McKinney do?" Leroy laughed. "You're not supposed to ask that. Hell, not even Miss McKinney knows what she did." Leroy looked around the neighborhood. No one was watching. Even Miss McKinney's blinds were closed. "You really want to know?" Jane nodded. "Every action has an opposite and equal reaction," Leroy whispered as he pulled a clipboard from his bag. A stack of pages with swirling images and colors lay attached to the board, the top page bearing Miss McKinney's name. Leroy tapped the page. The swirling colors coalesced into words and diagrams and information about Miss McKinney. "Let's see," Leroy said. Look here. The tipping point was a few days ago in a grocery store. Miss McKinney took too long paying, and so that Betty Devine, who lives down the street and was in line behind her, complained. But that's merely the peak of our nasty little iceberg. Miss McKinney also recently yelled at her grown daughter for staying engaged to a man who abuses her, and she said sacrilegious things to the preacher at her church, on Easter of all days. And here's something else about a baseball in her backyard not being returned." Jane frowned. "That would be Benny." The ball? Yes, I see the footnote. You are correct." "But none of that's bad." "Maybe not, but it's enough." Leroy shuffled the pages on his clipboard. "Want to see your page? Or your mom's?" Jane glanced at the clipboard's new top page, where her name appeared in black alongside a swirling rainbow of deeds and events from her life. She recognized the cruel words she'd said a while back to Benny, and the time she'd yelled at her mother because she didn't want to visit relatives. Jane even saw this very moment, as she wrongly learned of the connections and events which brought the torture bus to someone's door. Jane looked away. "I don't want to know." Leroy placed the clipboard back in his bag and reached under the van, pulling out the baseball. "You're a good kid, Jane," he said, even though Jane hadn't shared her name. He handed the ball back. "I've got something for you." Leroy pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it in Jane's hand next to the baseball. "One free torture," Leroy said. "You call that number, say a name, and the bus will pull up at their door within the hour." Jane stared at the card, which was absolutely black except for a series of glowing white numbers. Leroy stepped into the van and drove off with a big wave of his hand and a big grin on his face. Jane sat on her front lawn for the rest of the afternoon, the baseball in one hand and the card in another. An hour after Leroy left, a car stopped in front of Miss McKinney's house and her daughter stepped out. The daughter had a large bruise on her left eye, which Miss McKinney didn't comment on as the daughter helped her mother walk to the car. They drove off without a word, not wanting to be late for evening church services. Jane flicked the card against the baseball. Maybe she should call and name the abusive jerk engaged to Miss McKinney's daughter. He deserved to be tortured. Maybe it would make him stop hurting people. Or maybe Jane should call about Betty Devine, who'd been in line at the grocery store when Miss McKinney took so long paying. Of all the silly reasons to be angry at someone, Leroy said that incident was the tipping point which caused Miss McKinney to be tortured. Surely Betty Devine deserved punishment for that. But Jane was uncertain and carefully slid the card back in her pocket. Could it truly be this simple? The pages on the torture text clipboard showed so many slights and wrongs and mistakes and misunderstandings swirling around each person's life. So much information collected about each of them. Information building and growing until one minor issue went bumpty-bump and the torture bus arrived at your door. And Jane knew she wasn't innocent. Her own page had shown the time she'd yelled at Mom because she didn't want to visit relatives. Jane had been in a sour mood that day and merely wanted to be left alone. She didn't hate her family, but that was how Mom took it. When the torture techs eventually knocked on Jane's door and dragged in their Iron Maiden stretcher and satchel of scary tools, would they say, as Jane screamed, that this is how she'd made her mother feel on that long-ago day? Jane shuddered and cursed. Not pretend curses like the kids muttered to avoid bringing the torture bus, but a real curse. She was still sitting on her front lawn when Benny and the other kids walked down the sidewalk, returning from their pickup game. "Aw," Benny said in his booming, bragging voice, his baseball bat slung over his shoulder. "Jane has no one to play with." "That's going on your page," Jane thought, but didn't say. What she did say, though, was, "Piss off." The kids stared at her in shock. "What was that?" Benny asked in a low voice. "I said, piss off. Leave me alone." The kids looked around, as if bad language alone could cause the torture bus to appear. Benny's hands shook. Usually he was the one who spoke bad words and beat up kids and did all the other wrongdoings in their neighborhood. Benny pointed the baseball bat at Jane. "You better be careful," he warned. "My dad's been tortured 4 times, my mom 3 times. I don't fear the torture bus." "You should," Jane said as she stood up, her baseball grip tight in her hand, ready to be pitched at Benny's head if the bully attacked. "I'll crack your skull open with this ball before you reach me." Benny glanced nervously at the baseball Jane held. All the kids knew how good a pitcher she was. "You do that," Benny said, "and the bus will get you." "Maybe, but it will get you first. Your head will be split open and you'll be crying, and there will be the torture bus, the techs knocking at your door." Jane glared at Benny, daring the bully to try her. Jane felt the baseball in her hand, felt the business card poking her slightly in her pocket. Benny looked at the other kids. "Let the bus have her," he said, pretending to more bravery than he felt. "When the bus comes, we'll laugh as she screams." Jane jumped forward as if to bean Benny with the ball, causing him to stumble backward and fall. Benny quickly jumped up, his face red, embarrassed, and glared at Jane before walking down the sidewalk towards home. The other kids stared at Jane in shock before following him. Jane stood on the front lawn. Thick, green grass, although not as thick nor as green as Miss McKinney's yard. Jane knew this was going on her page, all of it. Every day of her life becoming merely one more step before the torture bus arrived for her. But if everything went on her page, did it even matter if she was good or bad? Jane pulled the card from her pocket and tapped it against the baseball. Benny and his friends would be at his house by now. They'd be laughing at her, calling her names, deciding what to do next time they caught her alone. Maybe, just maybe, the torture bus could take care of both Benny and his friends. It couldn't hurt to ask. Jane walked inside to make the call.
Whew.
That'd be it.
I don't think that I could breathe the entire time I was listening to that. That was intense.
Oh, thank you. It's been one of my... I really... I like all the stories I write. I've really loved this story. I wrote it for a submission to a political themed anthology. Didn't make the cut there. And, there was a lot of writers and stories. I won't name the anthology, but it was a good one when it came out. Mm-hmm. I submitted it to, I think, 8 or 10 other places. Came close. It went to rewrites for one place, a good pro magazine, but it just never quite clicked. It's a little bit different from most of the stories I write, and I think that might have been part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always, right editor, right time, right
Correct.
words, and even then, a whole helping of luck.
Oh yeah, and there's some you can have a very good story that I'm not trying to praise my story,
For
but
sure, yeah.
but I'm just saying there are plenty of great stories which don't end up getting accepted into pro publications or other places, and I could have kept submitting it around, but at some point I just I moved on. And
Yeah,
it just sat there, and then you sent this in. I was like, "Ooh, I got a trunk story I'd love to share."
nice. Yeah. It does, I don't know if it's the same anthology. I'm not going to name names either, but it reminds me of a story that ended up being the headlining story of an anthology I slushed for a number of years ago.
Ah,
Which, I'm not saying it's the same anthology.
no, I understand. Yeah, no.
But it's one of those things that, as a slush reader, you get to see, oh, so this didn't get accepted because we had another one just like that.
Exactly. That happens. When I was a young writer, I worked at a press called Meadowbrook Press, which was a independent publisher distributed by Simon and Schuster. They mainly did baby name books, but they also did kids poetry, funny poems for kids, Shel Silverstein, stuff like that, and anthologies of that. And they also did short stories for kids.
Nice.
And one of their series was Newfangled Fairy Tales. And I got to read Slush for the first edition, and I was like, oh, I want to try writing one. So I wrote one called Rumplestiltskin, Private Eye. And, showed it to the editor, and editor liked it. And, after rerounds, it got accepted. So I was still reading Slush for the series, and then one day I opened up an envelope, and there is a story from an author titled Rumplestiltskin, Private Eye. And my heart was like, oh, my God. But it's the same, mine had already been accepted. But then I was like, oh, God, this is going to sound like such a conflict of interest, even though I wasn't the editor of the series. But it was a different story, don't get me wrong, but there were similarities, even though we'd never read each other's. And so, yeah, it happens all the time, you don't know what, especially with themed anthologies. A few years ago, well, it might have been longer than that, maybe within the decade, or
time is fake, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there was a pirate anthology, well known, a couple of pirate anthologies, there was the pirate craze, not a while back, and publications and everywhere got flooded with pirate stories that got rejected from there, and it wasn't that they were bad stories, they were just, not too many for the anthology, and editors were like, I'd hear from them like, oh my God, I got 1 billion pirate stories in my queue right now, which then makes it harder for you to sell your pirate story.
Yeah. Yeah, when we had AJ Hackwith on the show that was 2 years ago now, September of 2019, I think, her story was there had been 2 or 3 dinosaur anthologies that had been happening in 2018, I think.
Yeah.
And hers was one that just didn't quite make the cut, and it was a great story, and I was super thrilled to have it on the show. But it just goes to show sometimes it's just a matter of the themed anthologies, and especially a dinosaur one is a lot easier than some of the hyper specific anthologies.
Oh, that makes it hard. That makes it very hard. I had a story come out a couple of years ago. It came out, Intergalactic Medicine Show. It's about a vampire set in the Renaissance or pre-Renaissance Italy. Which, funny thing, I'll mention in a second. But I'd written this for a themed anthology, and it got and the anthology was delayed. And at some point, I contact the editors, like, look, is my story have a real shot? And she was real cool, and she's like, no, it's not gonna, you'll get a rejection. So I went ahead and pulled it and submitted it and got it accepted somewhere else right before they sent out all these rejections so it was like, oh my God, I beat the rush, And the funny thing is that story features the same vampire that I have in a story that just came out last year in Asimov's called The 8000ers. It's the same character,
cool.
but in a different setting. She's on Mount Everest this time, tracking down entitled tech bros. It's definitely a commentary on my views on the tech industry in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's funny because if I had not gotten that story accepted, I probably never would have written a second story with the main character, even though they're totally standalone on each of them. So it's just how it works out.
That's so interesting to and like really shows just how random this industry is in some ways. So one of the things which I mentioned in the introduction is you write not just fiction, you also write nonfiction about the genre as a community for your genre grapevine column. And, I'm sure a million people have asked you this, but I always go for the low-hanging fruit if I can, which is what made you want to start that column? Because I find it such... Like, I'm always excited when a new genre grapevine comes out.
Oh, well, thank you.
And I've been supporting your Patreon for a while at this point because it's a valuable service, but it's one of those, like, the only other place that I ever have gotten genre news has been, like, the front matter in Locus every month.
Right.
And that has to go through, TradPub schedules of making print deadlines and everything, whereas you have much more of a much more latitude to do things because you're publishing online.
Right. Well, I like most writers, I have a job to support myself and my family. I've worked in the journalism field for a number of years. I'm a member of the Society of Professional Journalists. I used to work as a purely, I started off, my first job after college was a reporter for a small weekly paper, and went from there. So I've been a journalist for a long time, and ironically, one, I love doing that. I do, and so when I see something going on in the genre community, and I care a lot about the community, if there's something that irks me or something that just kind of rubs my back the wrong way, I'm like, oh, I want to do a story on that, and this gives me an outlet and ability to do that. But also in the jobs I've had, it's kind of funny. They kind of have prepped me to do this column in some ways, because the news, I do these little short news summaries, and like the last 3 jobs I've had, each of them, or 4 jobs actually, I had to do a similar type thing as what I do with the news summaries and stuff, but I do it for different industries and stuff like that, and so it's just my career in journalism has kind of trained me to do it, and it's kind of weird. At least finding the quirky and the interesting news to summarize and presenting it in briefs and stuff like that. But the longer form investigative journalism, I don't do that as much through the column, but it gives me an opportunity to do that too, and I really do. I think it's something we need is good journalism. Let's be honest. We can look at the society at the moment and see what happens when you don't, when journalists don't really practice what they should be doing. When lies and false information are accepted without critique, or accepted without any question.
Yeah. And it is, I grew up in a genre-heavy house, and my dad has been subscribed to Locus my entire life. So I grew up with having this publication coming into my house every month, but when I started writing, I'd leaf through Locus every once in a while, and it truly is a great resource as well, but there wasn't... I started writing with the aim of getting published in 2005, 2006, when there wasn't really social media in the way that there is now, when there wasn't when writing communities were all basically in-person affairs, or like,
Right.
they might be happening through message boards or chat rooms or whatever, but like the landscape since I started writing, and I don't know how long you've been writing with the aim to get published in science fiction, but like over our careers, I know how drastically it has shifted, and it really makes your Grapevine a truly valuable service because of just how much stuff happens.
Well, that gets into the other reason I do it is, as you were saying, every writer, no matter your genre, is at some point a beginning writer. Very few people, there are exceptions, but very few people jump into the writing scene with the connections and understanding of what's going on that they would have as a professional. There are exceptions. I won't say who they are, but but one thing that irked me when I was a new writer is not knowing all this information that people who'd been in the genre for a long time took for granted. And who not to submit to, or that, this publisher will rip you off. This publisher, they're good people, but they're going to take 2 years on your story,
Right.
submission, that kind of stuff. This was stuff that would be gossiped about and mentioned at conventions, but I didn't get to go to conventions until I was an adult, so I wasn't privy to that. I wanted to try to make it available for people so that it's not such a mystery on all this stuff. Share what you can. And now, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to just publish any bit of gossip, anything like that. I'm using journalistic standards. I source stuff, all that kind of thing. I got to have sources. I hear a lot more which I can't put in because I'm like, man, this is.
Yeah.
Well, this would be libel, and I got no source. Well, I can't. I'm not going to do that. But I mean.
Yeah.
And I'm not
this
writing.
This isn't a Lady Whistledown sort of situation.
Yeah. So, but yeah, no, and you want people to be able to know that, this stuff so that they can have a successful career too.
Yeah. And that's, that's another thing about it, which I think certainly in the decade and a half that I've been doing this, I've seen more people wanting to open doors, and definitely like I think throughout time there will be people saying that in any space there's too much gatekeeping, there's too much, exclusivity, any of that, but in the spaces that I'm in the spaces that we're in, like even for all of the garbage fire that Twitter is, like the writers I know on Twitter want to open doors and want to like create this openness.
Yeah. No, there are indeed, every genre has gatekeeping processes and has hurdles you have to overcome. Some fair, some not. Many of them not. I will say though, that the science fiction and fantasy genre is a lot more welcoming and supportive than many other genres. The so-called literary community of literary fiction and nonfiction is just an academic fiction, can be just a horrid place for backstabbing and stuff like that, and not helping writers succeed. The science fiction genre has many issues. It's been, with issues of exclusivity and diversity and other issues over the years, but in general, most writers in the genre try to help those who are coming after them. So, I have noticed that because I used to be in the literary. I used to edit a literary genre magazine, and oh my goodness, it was. I could tell tales.
Yeah. One of the things, sort of thinking on the ways that we've been trying to build inclusivity in science fiction, fantasy, horror, and the reactionary forces that have worked against that, I think is very interesting, not because there are reactionaries, because they're always going to be reactionaries, but that we actually, like, the things that were happening, and even if they were covered in some ways as like, oh, look at, this drama that's going on, when the Sad and Rabid Puppies really were taking hold and trying to bend the genre backwards, we got noticed outside of our community. And I think at the time there was it was difficult just because I felt like I had to do so much education in terms of like people who were suddenly saying, so what's this sad puppy, rabid puppy thing that's going on? But it raised awareness for so many people that there were people actually trying to make progress.
Yeah. No, agreed.
And
oh, absolutely.
I think that's fantastic, and I think it's terrible. Like, I obviously, my feelings have been made abundantly clear about the sad rabids, but in terms of what it was able to do to open doors for people and show people that there are, tons of writers out there and tons of brand new writers who are just breaking in right now, who, their voices wouldn't have been welcomed at the table.
Oh, yeah.
In the same way even 10 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the science fiction, fantasy, and horror genres are very popular both in the United States and around the world. If you look at video games, movies, films, books in those genres, hyper popular around the world. And yet the genre here, especially in the United States, for so many years pushed people away and said, well, we don't want you in it, because of who you are and all of that. And that I do think that is changing. Thank God. But I hate that it took something like the Sad Puppies, to really kind of kickstart the change in the genre. But, I think in the long term, people, I hope, maybe I'm projecting too much optimism, but I'm pretty optimistic usually. I think in the long term, people will look back and see that episode as a turning point in the genre. Doesn't mean the reactionary forces are gone, doesn't mean the people hating change in the genre are gone and trying to exclude people. None of that. Yes, that all still can go on, but I think you've seen a massive change in the genre in the last few years, that where the genre is actually starting to move towards representing and looking like the people who are actually reading and consuming the genre works around the world. Because let's be honest, if that's the genre would die otherwise. So, if you love science fiction, fantasy, and horror, you better hope it's representing the people who are watching and reading science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Otherwise, you got nothing. So, it's good. I like where it's going, and I know hopefully we'll keep going. But I swear it sometimes feels like 2 steps forward, 1 back. So,
for sure, and it it makes me sad. I was like sort of on a similar tangent yesterday on Twitter, thinking about how the AIDS crisis really wiped out an entire generation of queers and people who would have been my queer elders, certainly. And so thinking about the ways that, like, the current generation of writers are getting to be those queer elders and people of color elders and, all these formerly more marginalized groups. I'm not going to say they're not marginalized anymore, because they obviously are.
Yeah.
But there's so much more progress that's being made.
Yeah.
And showing people, getting people to see themselves in books.
No, absolutely. And you're mentioning what AIDS did to an entire generation. I'm old enough, without saying how old I am, that I can't. I experienced the tail end of the AIDS crisis before the drugs were able to revolutionize treatment. I witnessed, on a very personal level, I'm not going to go into details, but I count myself as a survivor there because I had very strong personal experiences there. And I saw what it did to a generation of people, to writers and artists and everybody else who are not here today. I think of all my friends I've lost over the years, and it wasn't just that; it was the ripple effects from that, how it affected communities, even to the present day. I was talking with a friend a few months ago who's doing oral history on all of this, doing recordings around the country, and he and I told him, I said, I've got only 1 or 2 friends from that time period who are still alive, if you know what I'm saying. So, yes, I'm glad things have changed. I mean, but there's still shit going on. I hate to say it. It's still so much, but I am glad that I think there's progress, and it's nowhere near fast enough for my desire or hopes, but it's still progress. But yeah, yeah. Sorry, you guys. I should tell you, I have an amazing ability to bring a conversation down to a real.
I mean,
I try not to do it, but it's like a superpower. I can just bring the conversation down to a real bad level
I brought
with just
up
a few
AIDS.
words.
It was, I'm not blameless in this. So bringing it back to specifically to writing and to your writing, I'm curious, as a journalist, what you bring from your day job to your writing.
I got to be honest. To my fiction writing, I do not bring a lot of journalism. Now, my journalistic writings through the genre grapevine and all that, yes, you can see the journalistic standards and how we write and all that.
For sure.
To my fiction writing, I would say, I'd like to pretend that journalism makes me a better writer and makes me be more concise and stuff, but I could be wordy as hell, I admit it. My fiction writing, and, I try to go back and cut and clean it up, but no, I think with my fiction writing, I'm writing, it's how I want to write it, and I can't do that with journalism. But I did get a lot of practice writing over the years in journalism. And when I, worked for a book publisher and all that kind of stuff, I got to experience critiques and editing and all that kind of, and that did obviously influence me heavily. But yeah, what Ernest Hemingway was famous for his fiction being journalistic, so to speak. Yeah, mine's not like that. So I admit it.
Yeah, it's, I do not, despite having gotten a degree in writing, I do not have a writing-focused job. I ended up getting a job in the tech industry, and it's very interesting to me the places where, I think that my training as a writer has helped me immensely in tech jobs, especially when I was working frontline support, just being able to communicate with people over email very effectively. But it's very interesting to me the specific things that my tech work brings back into my writing, and it's mostly just being very attentive to, if I'm using real technology, making it work right.
Right. I will say, I do bring, when I research something, I bring journalistic standards to it. If I'm, but a lot of my stories, are set in worlds where, current research it can be flexible, if you know what I mean. But now I have done it, going back to that 8,000ers story about the vampire on Mount Everest hunting entitled Tech Bros. That one I researched heavily, because it's set in the present time, it's set climbing Mount Everest, and obviously I've never climbed Mount Everest. I never want to climb Mount Everest. I have no desire to climb Mount Everest. So I researched heavily, how people did it, what they do, and all that kind of stuff. So there, yes.
Yeah.
So I remember I was even trying to figure out which other mountains, 8,000-meter mountains can you see from the summit of Mount Everest. So, I had to research all that.
Yeah. I will put in a quick plug here. Our volunteer transcriptionist is the author D.H. Dunn, whose series begins with... I see it from here. I'll put it in the show notes, but his series is centered around Mount Everest.
Oh, cool.
And so we haven't spoken in a while, but when we were meeting regularly in our writing group, he had in his office just a map of Mount Everest and all the locations and all of this stuff,
cool.
research material behind him. And so it's, as far as things to research, Everest has like a great deal of material already out there, which
correct. Yeah.
Compared to some of the things I find myself trying to research, it is, very nice to be able to just say, oh, okay, there is this much literature on this, as opposed to there is one stub Wikipedia article with 2 citations.
Correct.
Both of which are 404s now.
And you definitely, I think writers need to, if they're writing about the world around them and the people around them, they need to do their research. They need to, you don't just, I want to write this story set in Japan, but I've never been in Japan. I know nothing about Japanese culture or people or anything like that. Yeah, that's big red. I have big red alarm bells, and lights going off right there. But sometimes, in our genre, you can, you can also, if you got people who don't really know much about a subject or something, you might have some freedom there. It's always a balancing act. But you definitely, research, people need to research it, but then you got to be careful that, you always hear of the writers who did 20 years of research for something and never ended up writing the story either, so.
Yep. For sure. So at this point in the show, I just heard this weird noise and a blue police box showed up behind me. And I was just wondering if we could step into this time machine for a second and go back and talk to young beginning writer Jason and see if there are any things you know now that you wish you had known then.
One, I wish I'd known that it was okay to write genre fiction. I thought, I write the stories I want to write, and I grew up reading and loving genre works, but I definitely was impressed with the attitude that, science fiction, fantasy, and horror are not really true literature, so to speak, and that if I wanted to be a serious writer, I would have to write outside those genres. I did grow out of that, thank God. But, that was something I think I really, I remember I edited a literary journal, a general literary journal, for a long number of years, and my co-editor and I, we went to college together, and then when I met him and later, he's sadly passed away now, but he was asking, he's like, well, why do you write this? And I said, well, write in this genre. He's basically was implying, he was a poet and well published and big awards and stuff like that, and he was like, basically he was implying, oh, you're a good writer. Why are you wasting your time with this? And I said, well, this allows me to write the stories I want to write, and they matter. And I was able to find, I couldn't have articulated that as a beginning writer to him. I would have just been ashamed and all that kind of stuff. So that's one thing I wish I'd known. I wish I had known that you don't have to. Another thing, I always believed that, to be a serious writer, you have to write novels. Well, you know what? Short fiction is damn amazing. And some of the best writing I read is in short fiction. And most of my writing is short fiction because I love writing short fiction. Now, I do have a novel coming out later this year. That's cool. But, this attitude that to be taken seriously as a writer, you must publish novel-length fiction almost exclusively. Bullshit. I wish I'd known that earlier, because I've trunked a few novels over the years just because I was trying to force them out. Well, forcing out any kind of story is the worst thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I wish I'd known those things, and I wish I'd. And I'm still learning things about myself, and putting those in my writing, and so I wish I'd known when I was younger that it's okay to be who I am. Because unfortunately I feel like for too many years I tried to annoy who I was. No, I tried to avoid who I truly was, and I think that hurt my writing too. So those three things is what I would say.
Yeah. To touch on the short fiction versus novel thing, I think there's definitely short fiction in a lot of different spaces, and especially now with the online publishing revolution, TM, that there's so much space for short fiction, and I think genre has always been a place that's been sort of a haven for that.
Correct.
That we have this history, regardless of the many problems of the Golden Age and Silver Age pulps, that we've maintained this legacy of short fiction sometimes being a way for writers to come up. That I think sometimes it is definitely still treated as, you write short fiction until you are good enough to write a novel.
Correct. Exactly.
But there are so many authors who write short fiction almost exclusively, and that's amazing. And there are, some amazing authors out there who I've never read a novel from and don't even know if they have a novel out, but who, if I see their name in a table of contents in Uncanny or Analog or anywhere else, I will go and seek them out because I know their quality.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite writers is Randall Kenan, who sadly passed away last year. He did write his first book was kind of a novel. It was, I use that in quotes, but he was mainly known for his short stories. He has an amazing collection, came out in the early 90s, called Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. There is a story in there called Run, Mourner, Run. I urge everyone to read this story. Run, Mourner, Run by Randall Kenan. The first time I read this, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand. And I read this in an anthology of, I believe at the time it was one of the first big anthologies of gay and lesbian literature. And that was the term they used then. And I read the book, that story in there, and it blew me the F away. That a short story could have this much power. I immediately reread this story 2 times after that, and then sought out his work. And his other stories are great. And then, you always got the sense, where's his next book coming out? His next novel. When is he going to do a novel? Well, he did have a new short story collection come out last year, right before he came out, called If I Had Two Wings. This short story collection is amazing too. I mean, the man was a short story genius, and I recommend everybody read his work. I mean, there is nothing wrong with just writing short fiction. And there's nothing wrong with writing novels either. I mean, write what you need to write. But I think sometimes the marketplace and the culture pushes the idea, as you were saying, that novels are what makes you a serious writer. And I say bullshit to that, because the story should be what the story should be. And I don't want to read a novel which should have been a short story. You know what I'm saying? And in the genre, there's often, you've over the years, a short story will win an award, and then the author will a publisher will pay them to expand it to a novel. And it's like, I've never been impressed when that happens. Let the story should be what it should be. And if it should be a short story or short fiction, it can be a beautiful thing because it has a poetry and power that, is difficult to keep going over novel length.
For sure.
But read Randall Kenan. Read Randall Kenan, please, people.
Yeah. Links, as always, will be in the show notes, listeners, so I encourage you to hunt these books down. I'm just thinking in terms of, not novel length, but that the first 4 Murderbot novellas by Martha Wells are a perfect example of this, because each one is just this bite-sized morsel of...
I love them! I know!
Snark and glee and, like, a Murderbot who would really just rather be watching soap operas. And it's so good. And, I haven't yet picked up the Murderbot novel just because
it's great too, I gotta say. It is beautiful.
But, yeah, everything I've heard about it, it's amazing, and and I expect it to be, the Murderbot novellas, but bigger in some ways, but also, like, I know from, back to our very first guest on this show, Sarah Gailey, like, writing novelettes is such a different skill than writing a novel.
Exactly.
And you do different things with them.
Yeah. I will say I'm, as a writer, I'm a reader of genre first, but I'm also a writer. And nothing irritates me more than when I read a novel. And as a writer, I can detect this when you're reading a novel, and I'm like, this is filler to pad it out. Or this is, you know what I mean? This story was not, unfortunately, our genre is not sometimes known for padding of novels. But, like I said, when I read a novel that is just, wow, then that's, I love that. But yeah, I do get irritated with that kind of thing. You don't see that as much with short fiction because, at that length, if you start padding and fluffing up a short story, it's not going to work because of the short length. But you can get away with it with novel length fiction, but as a reader, it does irritate me. Yeah.
And, again, with the ways that the market has shifted, I think it's a lot easier. I'm not saying it's easy to get a novel or a novella or anything else published, but it's a lot easier to get a novella published now.
Oh, yeah,
and,
absolutely.
I know that Tor.com is publishing full-length novels as well, but Tor.com as largely at the beginning of their life as a novella publisher was amazing.
Oh, yeah. No, Tor.com has revolutionized novellas in the genre. Before 10 years ago, if you wrote a novella, there were a few magazines that might accept it in the genre. We're talking 2 or 3. And then if you didn't place into one of those, you were screwed.
You were basically done unless you got an anthology, like a collection deal.
I had a novella come out in Interzone, the British magazine. I believe it was 2010, and it was actually a finalist for the Nebula for Best Novella. And I was just, when they accepted it, it was like it was a stretch for them. They didn't publish many novellas, but I was just like, oh, thank you, because I had nowhere else to send it. And it's like, I was sitting there, wow, and that's a shame because novella is a powerful storytelling form. I love the novella form, but then that was in just 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, and then now it's totally different. And there's so many great novellas coming out, and the great thing is the novella space allows more experimentation with the stories and stuff that you might not get with a novel length fiction. And it's also, there are so many great new authors and new diverse voices coming up through publishing novellas. I mean, I just love it. So and I do. Most of that credit needs to go to Tor.com. They revolutionized it, and thank goodness they did. I love it.
Yeah, for real. So speaking of novels, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but your novel Plague Birds is coming out later this year. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. No. Yeah, Plague Birds. It's coming out from Apex Publications. The story. I originally published my first Plague Bird story in Interzone, the British sci-fi magazine, and it won their reader poll of the year for best story. And it's about it's science fiction, but reads like fantasy. It's a future Earth where genetic manipulation of humanity and animal genes being put into people have really changed humanity vastly. And then what you have is, in this society, you have artificial intelligence who are trying to return isolated groups of humans to more of a standard humanity as we used. But they would call what we are now their standard humanity. They're trying to return that. And you have creatures on this planet called Plague Birds, on Earth called Plague Birds, who are humans who are melded with a artificial intelligence in their blood, who basically judge and enforce the laws of the society. They do this by accessing the memories and everything like that. They're not well loved. So the novel is about a young woman who is tricked and betrayed into becoming one of these plague birds. And her quest to find out what's going on with her life. But it's also about finding your own community. It's about finding your own family, finding your place in the world. So I'm excited about it. But it's like I said, it's going to be coming out. So I published 2 Plague Bird stories in Interzone, and they were very well received. The second story is not in this. I reworked the first story as kind of the opening of the novel. But remember how I said I didn't like when a story was expanded?
Yep.
This one, I didn't expand the first story. I just used it as it's the starting point, and then I continued on with the novel. You know what I'm saying?
Very nice, yeah.
But I love the world so much, and readers really liked the characters and the situation so much that I was like, well, let me keep going to write a novel. So, and that's here we are today.
That's fantastic. So, before we get going, where can our readers find... readers... So before we get going, Jason, where can our listeners find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Jason Sanford, at Jason Sanford. And I'm also on www.jasonsanford.com. You can just Google me. I have a couple of short story collections out. Again, short fiction tends to be my thing right now. And you can check all that can be found on my website. Fantastic.
And I should also mention again your Patreon, where listeners can find your genre grapevine.
Correct.
You can always just Google genre grapevine, and that Patreon is patreon.com/JasonSanfordSF.
Thank you. Yep. No. Check it out. Please do. And I appreciate the support. Like I said, I do enjoy doing this journalism in the genre, and the Patreon support allows me to do that.
Yeah, it's an invaluable service, and I thank you for it greatly.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, no, anytime. I love doing this, and like I said, especially in these days, it's nice to be able to interact with people in the genre. I miss conventions.
For sure. For sure. Listeners, join us again next month for the beginning of Season 3 of Tales from the Trunk, if you can even believe it, when our guest will be Kelly Robson. Tales from the Trunk is mixed and produced in beautiful Oakland, California. Our theme music is Paper Wings by Ryan Boyd. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/trunkcast. All patrons of the show now get a sticker and logo button, along with show outtakes and other content that can't be found anywhere else. You can find the show on Twitter at Trunkcast, and I tweet at HBBisnieks. If you like the show, consider taking a moment to rate and review us on your preferred podcast platform. And remember, don't self-reject.